aircraft like the 787 to request the full length of the runway for takeoff. However, it gets confusing because sometimes people in the media, they don't understand this. And even just a few days ago, they were still saying that the plane used 3,500 meters for takeoff. So that's why I want to try and clear this up. And this is just one of the things that no one has talked about yet that I'm going to share with you. By the way, if you're new to the channel, I'm Hoover, and I used to fly the F-15E Strike Eagle, and now I fly for a major commercial airline, and I have a background in aviation safety. And the purpose of a pilot debrief is to focus on the facts so we can try to understand the root cause for aviation tragedies. That being said, if we look at the video of the takeoff, the camera angle doesn't make it possible to tell precisely where they begin their rotation, so it's easy to assume they're all the way at the end of the runway, because that helps confirm what happens in the rest of the video, where we see the aircraft struggling to climb and then start descending. That's something called confirmation bias, but we'll talk more about that later. However, if we go over to Google Maps, my guess is that the security camera that recorded this is somewhere around here, because we can see the road bend sharply to the left, plus you've got a building on the corner and what looks like some tires in the field, and all of that matches up with what we can see at the start of the video. The reason this is important is because in the video we can see that their initial rotation happens when they're hidden behind the shack. And if we draw a line representing the camera angle on Google Earth, it looks like they rotated somewhere around here, which is about 2,500 meters or 8,200 feet down the runway, but we still don't know that for sure. Now keep in mind that this runway is just over 3,500 meters or about 11,500 feet long, so 2,500 meters would be about 70% of the runway length, and that seems pretty normal. Unfortunately, we're never going to be able to confirm the precise distance down the runway where they rotated just by looking at the video, so let's go back to the ADS-B data to see what else we can learn. This is an image created by Flight Radar 24, where they compared the ADS-B data from the accident flight, which is the line in red, to the data from other 787 flights out of this airport during the past month. And just to clarify something real quick, if you don't know what ADS-B data is, it's the information that the aircraft transmits automatically that includes things like their barometric altitude and their ground speed, but it's never going to be as accurate as what's on the flight data recorder, which was just recently sent back to the US for analysis. Now this image depicts the aircraft being airborne before the end of the runway, meaning they didn't use the entire length. And it would seem like they took off around the same point as all of the other 787 flights. However, I think what's misleading about this is that the lines are based on an uncalibrated barometric altitude, so they don't accurately reflect the aircraft height above ground level, and it makes it look like the aircraft is a lot higher than it possibly was. The other thing I don't like about this is that there's no reference scale to understand the change in altitude or the rate of climb, and all these lines have different starting points both laterally and vertically because the ADS-B data populates at different times for each aircraft. That being said, I think it's reasonable to conclude that they didn't use the entire runway to get airborne, but there's a lot more to the story, and I'm going to share with you some of the other theories that you might not have heard about. But first, we need to talk about the pilots and the aircraft they were flying. When it comes to the pilots, the initial report said the captain in the left seat had over 8,000 hours of total flight time, but a recent email from Air India said he had over 10,000 hours. Either way, he was an instructor pilot with Air India and deeply respected in the aviation community. Sadly, just a few days before the crash, he told his father that he was about to retire so he could help take care of him full time. The first officer sitting next to him was relatively new, and sources claim he only had about 1,100 hours of total flight time, but Air India recently updated that number to 3,400 hours. Regardless of their experience, the situation they found themselves in is one that no pilot could ever imagine encountering, and I think they did the best they could to save as many lives as possible. I also want to take a moment to honor the victims in this awful tragedy. Somehow one passenger managed to miraculously survive, but there have been at least 279 confirmed fatalities so far, with 241 of those being passengers and crew, and another 38 people on the ground. Air India and their parent company have already offered compensation to the families affected by this, but I think most people would agree that no amount of money can ever replace a loved one. June 12th was supposed to be a normal day for them, and they boarded the plane for a routine flight from Ahmedabad to London. The Boeing 787 they were flying on is one of the most advanced airliners in existence today, with a remarkable safety record. But when it comes to the maintenance history of the aircraft, all we know for sure is what we've been told so far by the DGCA, which is essentially India's equivalent of the FAA. Now, the DGCA has conducted inspections of Air India's fleet of Boeing 787s and said that so far there were no major safety concerns. And this is really important to understand because one of the first goals of the investigation is to determine whether or not there's potentially an issue that affects all of the Boeing 787 aircraft worldwide. Because if so, they need to ground the entire fleet and inspect those aircraft. And I just want to emphasize that hasn't happened yet. And they're treating this as an isolated incident, so I wouldn't be worried about flying on a 787 right now. However, a lot of people have been sharing their experiences flying on Air India, and you might have seen this video filmed by a passenger allegedly on the plane that crashed, taken on the flight before the accident flight. In the video, he said basically nothing was working, like the touch screens, the air conditioning, or the call buttons for the flight attendant. So it's easy to see this and assume that maybe there was an electrical problem with the aircraft that somehow caused it to crash. But I'd argue this is just another example of confirmation bias. If you're not familiar, confirmation bias is when we tend to favor evidence that aligns with or supports a theory that we have. And if we step back, the truth is that this video might have absolutely nothing to do with the crash. That's why we need to wait for a full investigation into the maintenance history of the aircraft. And now that we've talked about the pilots and the plane, we need to look at what happened before they took off. Everyone has been really focused on the RAT deployment, which happened after they got airborne. And that's something we're going to talk about. But first, the point of a debrief is to consider all of the possible contributing factors, which would include what might have happened in the cockpit before they took off. However, instead of speculating, I'm going to share with you what the investigators are going to be looking for when they review the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data. Plus, I think this part is really important because it gives you a better picture of how pilots handle emergencies on takeoff. First of all, what normally happens is after the pilots have finished their pre-flight of the aircraft and they're ready to go, they're going to do a takeoff briefing before they taxi out to the runway. This is where they talk about things like the weather, the taxi plan, the departure, and the threats. But they also brief takeoff emergencies, sometimes referred to as abnormals. Typically, whoever is flying is the one who does the briefing, except the captain always briefs the abnormals because the captain is the one responsible for the safety of the flight. And if you have to abort the takeoff, the captain is the one performing the abort procedure. The reason this is important is because even though the takeoff might have appeared normal on video, the truth is that we have no idea what was going on in the cockpit or what kind of indications they had. When it comes to the briefing, the captain will usually say something like, "Today we're going to abort for pretty much any abnormal indications as long as we're below 80 knots. That's because below 80 knots, you can easily bring the aircraft to a stop on the runway and deal with the problem on the ground instead of trying to continue the takeoff and deal with it in the air. But the thing is, once you're above 80 knots but below V1, which I'm going to explain what V1 is in a second, but between 80 knots and V1, you're usually only going to abort for engine failure, engine fire, or loss of thrust. Basically anything that might keep the aircraft from flying. So that means if they had a loss of thrust on takeoff before V1, I would have expected them to abort. This is where you need to understand that whoever was not flying the plane, their job during the takeoff is to be the pilot monitoring, and that means they keep an eye on the engine indications, and usually at 80 knots they'll make a call out to the other pilot saying something like 80 knots checked, and that means everything's looking good. After that, the next airspeed they're looking for is V1. Think of V1 as like the point of no return for an aircraft because it's the safest speed where you can still safely abort the takeoff using the runway remaining, but it's also the minimum speed you need to take off with one engine failed. An engine failure that happens right at V1 is one of the most challenging scenarios for pilots, and that's why it's something that we train for in the simulator all the time. The reason I'm bringing this up is because if we go back to the video, it doesn't look like there's any signs of an engine failure during the takeoff roll. But we also can't see the beginning of the takeoff roll, and we also can't see the most critical moment of the takeoff when they're starting to rotate because they're hidden behind the shack. So we still don't know for sure if they had an engine failure or something else abnormal happened before they rotated. It's also worth mentioning that if they did have an engine failure on takeoff, you might expect to see some yaw from the aircraft, but it's possible that the reason why you're not seeing that is because, first of all, the video quality isn't the best, but more importantly, the 787 flight controls are so advanced that once you're above 60 knots on the ground, and also once you get airborne, the system automatically inputs rudder to counter the majority of that yawing moment due to an engine failure, so we might not even notice it in the video. Therefore, we could easily assume that they had full thrust for takeoff and the initial rotation, but it's also just as likely that they could have had some kind of engine failure or loss of thrust after V1, but before they rotated. We just don't know. So instead of speculating about that, let's talk about what happened after they got airborne, and then I'll share with you something that no one wants to say about this tragedy. One of the questions that a lot of people have been asking is, why did the pilots leave the landing gear down after they took off? And I think that's a great question, because normally after V1, the pilot monitoring will say rotate when you hit rotation speed, and then he'll say positive rate when you're climbing away from the ground. That's the cue for the pilot flying to call for the gear to be raised, but why didn't that happen? Now, I don't want to speculate, but I will say that if something catastrophic took place right around the time they rotated and you're struggling to fly, that's definitely going to catch you off guard. So now maybe you're not thinking about the landing gear because you're trying to figure out what just happened. Also, it's worth mentioning that one of the initial theories was that the pilot was going to raise the landing gear but accidentally raised the flaps instead. Now, I'd argue that this theory doesn't really make any sense because the gear handle isn't located anywhere near the flap handle, and I can't imagine any pilot getting the two of them confused. Additionally, because there's been a lot of talk about the flaps, let me just say that we can't really tell the flap position from the videos, so that's something we're going to have to wait for the flight data to confirm. All we know for certain is that something went terribly wrong almost immediately after they got airborne and the aircraft began descending over the city. Now, this other video is the one that's got like 20 million views because it appears to show the rat deployed on the right side of the aircraft, and you can allegedly hear it in the beginning of the video. If you're not familiar, the rat is what provides the aircraft with an emergency source of backup electrical power, and there's a handful of things that will cause the rat to deploy, but the main one that everyone is talking about is a dual